Hello class, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we're studying Margaret Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century. Now I want to offer you several different perspectives for thinking about the significance of Fuller's work. First of all, it's a pioneering text in the American women's rights movement. Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a romantic argument for women's rights, was published in the 1790s in Britain. So 50 years later, Fuller is offering another important articulation of this kind of a romantic argument for women's equality. In America, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who were Quakers living in South Carolina, and their families were slaveholders, they wrote important works, both abolitionist texts and women's rights texts in the 1830s. Fuller's work was published first in 1843 and then 1845, first in the Dial and then published as Woman in the 19th Century. And that's just a few years before the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848. And out of that convention came a short document called the Declaration of Sentiments. So Fuller's text, Woman in the 19th Century, is right in this moment in the 1840s, right before that Women's Rights Convention kind of in a way officially launches a women's rights movement in the United States. Secondly, I would like you to think about the radical nature of Fuller's argument for equality. And by radical, I mean in that meaning of the word radical, dealing with the fundamental aspects of an issue, the root of a problem. The word radical comes from the Latin word for root. And third, to think about how the founding premise or principle of Fuller's arguments is a romantic ethic of self-culture and self-reliance. And that really helps us see how Fuller is, in the transcendentalist movement, making an argument for women's rights. And it makes Fuller a very interesting example in relation to our course theme about rethinking democratic individuality and selfhood. In our current political context here in the 21st century, individualism is often or usually really equated with a conservative politics, with that anti-government or limited government view that classic liberalism articulated. Remember John Locke, and that's a view that is endorsed by the right wing of American politics today. But Fuller shows how a commitment to individuality and self-culture in that Emersonian tradition can actually support a radical progressive argument for social equality and reform. And there are other thinkers who we might call left Emersonians, like John Dewey. He's another one who has enlisted an Emersonian commitment to individuality in order to critique the more conservative aspects of a classic liberal individualism. And lastly, as we always want to do when we're reading a literary text, we both want to understand it within its historical moment, and then we want to evaluate it from our moment. Think about its significance for us today. So first of all, you can compare the radical nature of Fuller's argument to other thinkers in her time. So to Emerson, for instance. Although Fuller is very much taking an Emersonian idea of self-culture and individualism, and applying it to women's rights. And although Emerson himself was an advocate or a supporter of the women's rights movement, Emerson never articulated anything like this kind of a argument for gender equality that Fuller did. And she's also radical when you consider her in relation to other women writers of her moment. So we'll be reading Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin from that book. She's a woman writing an anti-slavery reformist work, and you'll see that Stowe's vision of gender relations is quite a bit more traditional than what Fuller is doing here. So this Fuller helps us appreciate how transcendentalism, or romanticism more broadly, really could promote a belief that all aspects of human society could be reformed. And then we can also compare Fuller to our own day. Think about the ways in which Fuller was really ahead of her time. How many of the attitudes that she affirms, which, while considered radical in her day, are pretty widely accepted by us today in 2016, and also consider the problems that she discusses, the obstacles to full gender equality. How many of those problems are still with us? So just a reminder, that term self-culture from from Emerson and Self-Reliance. It's the idea of cultivating the self, the idea that one's self or individuality or character is a project, something you must work at or build. And it comes very much from an idea from German Romanticism, the idea of Bildung, and that German word Bildung means that process of educating, cultivating, or the maturing of the self. And I just want to remind you some of those moments in Self-Reliance where we see in Emerson this commitment to self-culture, right? So the top passage here, you can see I've highlighted, he uses a metaphor, right? Every person must come to take himself for better or worse. That nothing good can come to him except through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given him to till. Well, that's a metaphor. Emerson doesn't mean we all have to work out in the yard hoeing our beans or growing our pumpkins and squash. He means our self is what we've been given to till, to cultivate in life, right? The second one where he talks about doing your work. Do your work and you shall reinforce yourself. That notion that you build yourself, you strengthen yourself, your character, your personality, right? And then third, that very interesting example from Self-Reliance where Emerson talks about a sturdy young lad from New Hampshire or Vermont who does all these different jobs, tries all these different professions and occupations, and always lands on his feet like a cat, Emerson says, right? And the passage I've highlighted here in the end, that tell men they can and must detach themselves, that with the exercise of self-trust, new powers shall appear. The idea here that if you're willing to try new things, work on a variety of jobs or occupations, you're going to discover and build and cultivate new talents and powers. Then the fourth one, Emerson talking about the force of character being cumulative. He says, if I can be firm today, it must be that I've done right enough in the past, that I've got that strength to do it now. That somehow all those foregone days of virtue work their health into this. So your character isn't just something that you're born with, it's something that you've built. And if you spend time developing a certain part of yourself, then you're going to have that as a resource to draw upon. Habits is one way to think about this. That's what John Dewey would call it. And then lastly, an example where Emerson talks about, like, what do we get from self-culture? Well, he says too much people look at property. They esteem each other by what they have and not what they are, right? But a cultivated man, notice cultured, cultivated. A cultivated man becomes ashamed of his property, Emerson says, out of a new respect for his nature. That which a man is does always by necessity acquire, and what the man acquires is living property, Emerson says. So there's this idea that in Emerson, in Romanticism generally, that yourself, building yourself is kind of the most important property that you have in life. Okay, so I want you to see how much this kind of an Emersonian principle of self-culture, or self-reliance as Emerson calls it, is at the heart of Fuller's argument in Woman in the 19th Century. So here's a passage. I'll read it along and then call your attention to some of the things that I've highlighted here. I would not deal with atrocious instances except in the way of illustration, neither demand from men a partial redress in some one matter, but go to the root of the whole. If principles could be established, particulars would adjust themselves aright. Ascertain the true destiny of woman, give her legitimate hopes and a standard within herself. Marriage and all other relations would by degrees be harmonized with these. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. Were this done, and a slight temporary fermentation allowed to subside, we should see crystallizations more pure and of more various beauty. We believe the divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in the history of former ages, and that no discordant collision, but a ravishing harmony of the spheres would ensue. Yet then and only then will mankind be ripe for this, when inward and outward freedom for woman as much as for man shall be acknowledged as a right, not yielded as a concession. As the friend of the Negro assumes that one man cannot by right hold another in bondage, so should the friend of woman assume that man cannot by right lay even well-meant restrictions on woman. If the Negro be a soul, if the woman be a soul, apparelled in flesh, to one master only are they accountable. There is but one law for souls. And if there is to be an interpreter of it, he must come not as man or son of man, but as son of God. Were thought and feeling once so far elevated that man should esteem himself the brother and friend, but nowise the lord and tutor of woman, were he really bound with her in equal worship, arrangements as to function and employment would be of no consequence. What woman needs is not as a woman to act or rule, but as a nature to grow, as an intellect to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, to unfold such powers as were given her when we left our common home. If fewer talents were given her, yet if allowed the free and full employment of these, so that she may render back to the giver his own with usury, she will not complain. Nay, I dare say she will bless and rejoice in her earthly birth, her earthly lot. Let us consider what obstructions impede this good era, and what signs give reason to hope that it draws near. Okay, so I hope you can see here that first of all, Fuller is saying, let's start with principles. I don't want to just reform one little part of society, but let's start with principles and go to the root of the whole. And if we get those principles right, then we'll figure out how to adjust all the other parts of our lives correctly, right? And what is her principle? Really, as she says, what women need, like all people, like all souls need, is the ability to unfold and develop and grow the talents and the gifts that they were given when they came into this world, right? As a nature to grow, an intellect to discern, a soul to live freely and unimpeded, right? Ascertain the true destiny of woman, give her legitimate hopes and a standard within herself. So she's saying women, like all people, like all human beings, are selves, are souls, and what they really need is the opportunities to develop that self. What does this require? Well, for one thing, she says, let's have every arbitrary barrier thrown down, every path laid open to woman. And she says, if we do that, there's not going to be some kind of discordant collision, some kind of disorder in society, but a ravishing harmony of the spheres. Now, that's a kind of a funny phrase from Renaissance ideas of how the cosmos was put together, but it's referring to the spheres of society, the domestic feminine sphere and the male public sphere, and we'll hear more about that in relation to Stowe as well. So here's her principle. What do women need? They need the ability, the right, the freedom granted to them to do what souls need to do, which is to unfold those powers that they were given by God, right? And so then she says, well, at the end of this passage, let's consider what the obstructions are. And so as you move forward in your reading, I'd like you to think how Fuller, starting from this principle of romantic self-reliance or self-culture, what are the different institutions in society that Fuller argues need to be reformed to provide women with the liberty they need and the support that they need for self-culture. So as you're reading Woman in the 19th Century, the excerpts that I've given you, look at what she says about political rights, about legal rights like property, about occupations and work, about marriage and how it should be reformed, about education for women, about how we might need to rethink our ideas about how gender shapes identity, and about men's attitudes towards women. That's just a list. You may find more, but certainly I think you'll see her dealing with all of those. So just as one final example, in that previous passage we were looking at, Fuller says, we would have every path laid open to woman as freely as to man. So a freedom of occupation, right? And in a very famous moment in Woman in the 19th Century, she says, if you ask me what offices they may fill, I reply, any. I do not care what case you put, let them be sea captains, if you will. I do not doubt there are women well fitted for such an office, and if so, I should be as glad to see them in it as to welcome the Maid of Saragossa, or the Maid of Missolonghi, or the Suliote heroine, or Emily Plater. Those are examples of female heroes from history that Fuller cites elsewhere in the book. This is like one of the most famous things Fuller wrote. Let them be sea captains. It's something that readers took and ridiculed in the newspaper. But there she is, she's standing by it, right? And think about this idea that how much, I think in our society today, we believe this too, or want to believe this. And yet what are ways in which our society maybe still is holding back on this idea that women can really do all the jobs that men can do, or should do all the jobs that men can do? But here's Margaret Fuller in 1843 and 1845, right? And then she says, look at society. And she says women need a much greater range of occupation that they have. Why? To rouse their latent powers. Again, remember that sturdy young lad from New Hampshire and Vermont that Emerson talked about? How does he develop his self? Well, because he tries all these different things, right? And Fuller says women need a range of occupation for the same reason. And she says, look at little girls. If you watch Girls in a Family, she says, I know little girls who like to saw wood and use carpenter's tools. And when these tastes are indulged, they're cheerful and good-humored. But if they are forbidden from doing these things, because such things are not proper for girls, they grow sullen and mischievous, Fuller says. And she says, yeah, well, look at also, we see an ennui that haunts grown women, ennui being a French word for kind of a depression or a world weariness. And so it's not just little girls who get, depressed by these attitudes, but grown women, adults who've been held back. She cites Charles Fourier here, the French socialist reformer, and you'll read a little bit about him in A Woman in the 19th Century. And she lauds here, she cites Fourier's idea of reforming society, that society should be reformed in a way in which men and women all get to do a variety of different kinds of occupations, right? So Fourier proposes a great variety of employments in manufactures or the care of plants and animals. And he allows that 1/3 of women would be as likely to have a taste for masculine pursuits and 1/3 of men for the feminine. So Fuller's saying, let's rethink our idea of what jobs are appropriate for men and for women, and let's leave them open to everyone, right? Okay, so let them be sea captains, Margaret Fuller says to us, and I hope that you will really enjoy reading her text. And as Margaret Fuller says that to you, I say happy reading, and I'll look forward to discussing Margaret Fuller with all of you. Thanks.